Buonasera a tutti, riprendiamo le fila del nostro discorso salutando i due nostri ospiti internazionali, Deirdre McCloskey e Joel Mokyr, che partecipano a Umanesimo digitale qui a Maratea in collegamento dagli Stati Uniti. Io, per collegarmi a proprio l'ultima fase della discussione, dico che la bellezza di questi luoghi, di questa Villa Nitti e l'innovazione che deve prendere sempre più corpo in quest'epoca anche nel Mezzogiorno del nostro paese possono e devono coesistere. È una lezione per tutti, ma alla fine di questa giornata intensa concludiamo con una visione globale, due keynote speaker, due intellettuali di livello mondiale, due personalità complesse con idee diverse che si confrontano, diverse visioni che dal passato è l'attività prevalente di alcuni di loro, in particolare di Joel Mokyr, ma anche la McCloskey si è occupata di storia, e dal presente, perché Mokyr si è interessato a questioni attualissime, addirittura alla robotica e alla quarta rivoluzione industriale, e la McCloskey con i suoi pensieri approfonditi sulla realtà contemporanea aprono ambedue uno squarcio sul futuro. È lo spirito che anima Sud&Nord, promosso dalla Fondazione Nitti e da Merita, da Claudio De Vincenti e Stefano Rolando, che sono qui con noi e che domani concluderanno i lavori insieme ad altre personalità di livello nazionale ed europeo. Accogliamo questi due studiosi che si uniscono, pur avendo idee diverse, nell'interesse e nella passione per la storia economica. La storia economica, lo abbiamo ricordato questa mattina, è una disciplina piccola che è stata ritenuta da Carlo Cipolla al confine, sospesa tra due culture. Abbiamo ricordato anche la lettura di Charles Peirce Snow del 1959 all'Università di Cambridge, ma ora io credo che siamo oltre. In particolare questa piccola disciplina ha una metodologia molto avanzata e una capacità di ritorno al futuro, perché non solo la sua tecnica abduttiva, ma soprattutto la sua capacità di tenere insieme diacronia e diatopia, l'interpretazione delle dinamiche e la capacità di calarle nella geografia attraverso una doppia chiave, quella della contestualizzazione, dell'inserimento all'interno di un contesto, e dall'altro di una comparazione, di una capacità di mettere a confronto diverse realtà e diversi tempi, sono sicuramente strumenti molto validi per il nostro presente e per il nostro futuro. I titoli dei due interventi di McCloskey e Mokyr sono singolarmente vicini, anche se assolutamente non collimanti. Il titolo dell'intervento della McCloskey sono state le idee liberali, la retorica e l'ideologia, non gli investimenti e le istituzioni a creare il mondo moderno. E il titolo dell'intervento di Joel Mokyr è gli incentivi, le istituzioni e l'industrializzazione, un preludio alla crescita economica. Quindi sicuramente un confronto molto interessante tra due diverse personalità. Io voglio ringraziare Antonio Buonocore che ci assiste per una sintesi degli interventi in modo da farci comprendere agli amici che intervengono dall'estero e al tempo stesso poi far comprendere i loro interventi, che saranno in lingua inglese, agli ascoltatori italiani. Io inizio a presentare rapidamente Deirdre McCloskey prima di darle la parola, perché è utile che anche il pubblico più vasto possa avere perlomeno un tratto, un lineamento di queste due grandi personalità. Poi, al momento di dare la parola a Joel Mokyr, illustrerò brevemente anche le sue caratteristiche. La McCloskey è professore di economia, storia, emerita di inglese e comunicazione presso l'Università dell'Illinois a Chicago. Si è formata ad Harvard come economista, ha scritto una trentina di libri e oltre 400 articoli su teoria economica, storia economica, filosofia, retorica, etica e diritto. I suoi libri più importanti hanno tutti titoli molto intriganti, vanno da come essere umani anche se si è economisti, fino al culto della importanza statistica, cioè come l'errore standard ci costa posti di lavoro, giustizia e vite, e poi una trilogia molto importante sulla borghesia, le virtù borghesi e un'etica per un'epoca del capitalismo, e poi la dignità borghese, perché l'economia non può spiegare il mondo moderno, e infine l'ultimo di questa trilogia, l'uguaglianza borghese, come le idee, non il capitale o le istituzioni, hanno arricchito il mondo. Il libro più recente è un libro che titola Perché il liberalismo funziona, come i veri valori del liberali producono un mondo più libero, più equo e prospero per tutti. Il suo lavoro scientifico è stato sulla storia economica, in particolare su quella britannica. Questo libro sull'eguaglianza, sulla borghesia, che è in grado di essere portatrice di valori di eguaglianza, è uno studio sulla storia economica e sociale olandese e britannica, scritto sul fallimento dell'economia britannica alla fine del 1800, sul commercio e sulla crescita dell'Ottocento, sull'agricoltura del Medioevo, sul gold standard e sulla rivoluzione industriale, ma si è occupata anche di filosofia e ha scritto articoli e volumi sui limiti del positivismo scientifico-sociale, i limiti epistemologici di una futura scienza sociale, una filosofia della scienza retoricamente sofisticata. Si è occupata anche di globalizzazione e infine nel libro sulla virtù dei borghesi ha messo in evidenza come, e lo ha fatto per la verità in tutta la trilogia, sia importante sostenere e elaborare soprattutto idee innovative e che il populismo non rovina le nostre prospettive, soprattutto l'idea di un mondo di dignità e prosperità universale che può essere creato ed è stato effettivamente creato a suo avviso dall'innovazione liberale, cioè un capitalismo con grande capacità di innovazione. Finisco dicendovi che ha una doppia bibliografia, Deirdre McCloskey, una biografia formale e una informale, e di questa informale vorrei leggervi quello che ha dichiarato di sé. Si descrive come una donna letteraria, quantitativa, postmoderna, di libero mercato, progressista e episcopaliana, ex marxista, del Midwest di Boston, non conservatore. Sono un liberale classico cristiano. Diamo la parola ringraziandola e salutandola a Deirdre McCloskey.
Here we go.
Hi, welcome.
All right, I assume that you can hear me, as I'm told, and I'll start my timer. We've got 25 minutes. Try managing the sound options on your computer. Well, that's a little hard to do right now. I'll just speak my piece. And that is, how do we explain how we in the north of Italy, the south of Italy, the south of the United States, the north of the United States, Japan, Finland, how we became so rich? From the caves to 1800, the average human made and spent in modern American dollars about $2 or $3 a day. There are a few places in the world where that's still true, though fortunately, even those places now are often starting to grow. Think of Bangladesh nowadays, or indeed southern Italy a couple of centuries ago. Italian GDP per person in American dollars, inflation corrected, rose from, hear this, $3 a day in 1800 to about $100 a day now. That's a factor of increase over the appalling condition of the world in 1800 of not 100% or 200%, but 3,000%. In the southern Italians who moved to the United States were improved by the move, and their great-great-grandchildren, my former wife's father, for example, found their income going from that $2 a day and in southern Italy in 1800 to the US average of $150 a day. Now, I have to start by saying what does not explain this enormous increase in income. I mean, it's the most, well, I would say it's the second most secular event in human history, only after the invention of agriculture. Now, the first thing that does not explain it is exploitation, the coerced theft from one person by another. I mean, this is somewhat obvious, but it has to be said. If you move income around in what people call the zero-sum situation, and you move it from Peter to Paul, it's clear that the average income of the whole society of Peter and Paul does not change. I mean, that's plain. It's simply a redistribution. So in some fundamental sense, there has to be some consequence of this supposed theft from the working class, or from empire, or from unequal trade, as it's often said in Marxism, for there to be a consequence in raising the average. The average doesn't rise if all you do is move things back and forth. Now, it's an important historical finding, which some people don't believe, but is true, that enrichment did not come, historically speaking, from enslaving people. Slavery was not the way to wealth, or else the countries that did not have slavery, Canada, for example, would now be poor compared with, say, the United States, which did. And the same thing is true of imperialism. The Italian adventure in the 1930s in imperialism did not make the average Italian higher in income. And somewhat surprisingly, the same thing is true of the empire of the English in India, above all, and in Africa. Historical research has shown that the average English person was not made better off by from the empire. Now, exactly as in the case of exploitation and redistribution, some people were made better off, and that was wonderful for them. The extreme case of this is King Leopold II, who had as his personal property the Congo, and he exploited it mercilessly in the late 19th century. But his income, which he used to build castles in the south of France, did not benefit the average citizen of his kingdom, namely Belgium, at all. So the argument from the left that we're rich, whoever the we are, is because someone else has been made poor, does not work to explain a 3,000% increase. It might explain, say, imperialism might explain a 10% increase, or maybe even a 50% increase in some case, but it couldn't possibly explain 3,000%. Now, from the right, from a conservative position, the common argument is that enrichment comes from investment, from the accumulation of capital in roads and houses and factories and ships and machines and so forth. Now, it's clear that for some kinds of progress, investment is necessary. It's plain that the modern world would not work with the level of Italian illiteracy in 1800. It had to be the case for a modern economy to work that the great majority of Italians came to know how to read. And that's an investment in schools and so forth. So investment is very often necessary for economic progress. But the key point here is that it's not sufficient. In fact, even this, what economists call education, namely the accumulation of human capital, fairly clearly can't explain an increase in real income on the order of 3,000%. As you can see from the gain that you get from graduating from secondary school as against not, or graduating from university as against not. I won't mention getting a PhD, which actually makes your income fall. But it's clear from those numbers that you couldn't possibly explain an explosion such as 3,000% with sheer investment in education. And it's clear that all investment, all accumulation of capital, unless it's accompanied by innovation, by new ideas, experiences very sharply diminishing returns. You have an automobile. I always stutter in Italian, una macchina. If you had two, that would make you somewhat better off. If you had three, well, you'd have to find a parking place for the third one. 4, 5, 6. This is crazy. This is not that fifth automobile does not improve your situation at all. In fact, at some point, it becomes, so to speak, garbage, a bad, not a good. And that's true of ordinary investment in machinery or roads or whatever. So sheer accumulation, which is what economists since Adam Smith, I always cross myself when I speak of Adam Smith, have focused on, sheer investment is not the cause of economic growth. It's necessary, often, not always, but often. It's helpful, and I'm glad to have it, but it's an intermediate cause. And this is very important. It's an intermediate cause. It's caused by other things. For example, if a manufacturer has it in his mind to build a new factory, the idea for the factory obviously comes first. He has to, and he has to make a guess, a calculation, a hopeful extrapolation that building the factory will be profitable as against the cost. So ideas are crucial here. Hold that thought. Nor to disagree with my old and dear friend, we've been friends for half a century, Joel Mokyr, is a third possibility that I'm going to say is wrong, namely what I would call the statist explanation that institutions supported by lo Stato are the cause of modern economic growth. Institutions, now hear this, I think Italians will more or less instantly agree with this. Institutions without ethics underlying them don't work. You can add as many levels of Italian government as you want. You can change the tax system. You can do all kinds of things. And if the people running the bureaucracies are cheats, ladri, it's not going to work. If the change in the tax system means that Italians work even harder to evade taxation and no increase in tax happens, the institution doesn't work. Now, this is something I would claim. I'm a friend of Italy. I love your country. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva, etc., etc. This fact that ethics grounds institutions is something that Swedes don't understand, because they assume that everyone's going to be, in some sense, ethical. But an Italian or an American from Chicago doesn't assume this. That's the first point. that to really understand institutions and their function, you have to speak of ethics, ideology, what you learned at your mother's knee, and what you learned from going to the movies and talking to your friends, all those things that make for a person, whether a bad person or a good person. So that's the first point about institutionalism, so-called neo-institutionalism. But there's another very important point, which institutions, like, as I said, in investments, are intermediate. They're not the primum mobile. They aren't the ultimate cause. Take, for example, an institution, a peculiar and evil institution, once in my own country, of slavery. Slavery had awful consequences. It was certainly an institution, and it had causes and effects and so forth. But the support for slavery had to be ethical. In the case of the slave owners, they believed, at least most of them did, that their ownership of slaves was perfectly ethical. And in fact, against the abolitionists, they were more persuasive in citing examples in the Bible, because both in the Hebrew Bible and what Christians call the New Testament, we have a slave society. Its ending, of course, is perfectly obvious, was a matter of ethical change. So what's my explanation? My explanation is ideational. And here, Joel Mokyr and I completely agree that what makes the economy start to grow, what makes it eventually succeed, is not machinery, slavery and exploitation and investment and so forth, but is ideas. Joel and I are members of a very small school in economic history that I would call the ideational school, not idealistic like Croce, but focused on changes in ideas. Now, what change in ideas could have such immense effects as the 3,000% increase? And my answer is a word I always stutter on, alas, liberalism. Defined as Italians define it, not in the strange way that we in the United States define it as sort of vaguely socialist, gentle socialism. That's what people mean by it in the United States. But in Italy, you mean a society, economy, polity of non-slaves. It goes back, of course, to the Latin, which to the Romans only meant non-slavery. The word liber indicated non-slavery. And slavery is not a metaphorical concept as it became in Christian theology, but was a legal concept. Being a non-slave meant not being a slave to any master, including il governo ladro, see? It was an entirely new idea in the 18th century, this idea of a society of non-slaves, or as you might also say, a society of adults. As I've been saying for the last couple of years, liberalism could be thought of as adultism. And it, of course, it was, how can I say, it was imagined on a fairly large scale by intellectuals in Europe, especially in the northwest of Europe, in places like Holland and England and Scotland, although not entirely. I mean, it was also imagined by people elsewhere in France and Italy to some degree, but mainly in the Northwest. And then it was slowly implemented over the next couple of centuries. The symbolic date here is 1776, the publication date of The Wealth of Nations, and also the date when a conflicted slave owner named Thomas Jefferson said that all men are created equal. And the argument is, for this massive effect, is that liberalism, making people non-slaves, gave, as the English say, this is not an American expression, allowed people to, as they say, have a go. The sporting English think of it that way, have a go. And allowing people to have a go was inspiriting. And I have a lot of evidence for this, and I could spend the next 5 hours outlining some of the evidence. But I'm at the end here. This inspiriting of treating people equally in permission, made people, I claim, bold, and made them courageous, coraggio, to venture in the arts, classical music, for example, in science, certainly, the explosion of chemistry in Germany in the 19th century, in the society generally, in the polity, and I say in conclusion, in the economy. It's the ideology, the ethics of liberalism that made us rich and could, if it were thoroughly adopted in the south of Italy, make the south of Italy rich. Thank you very much.
Perfetto. Allora diamo la parola ad Antonio Buonocore che sintetizzerà il discorso di Deirdre McCloskey.
Benissimo, si tratta di un intervento che ha praticamente considerato moltissimo, però innanzitutto dalle caverne fino al 1800 l'uomo ha speso circa $3 al giorno, ed è ancora vero per certi paesi come il Bangladesh o come per lo stesso Sud Italia di qualche secolo fa, come ha citato la stessa professoressa. Vero è che il PIL degli Stati Uniti è cresciuto del 3000%, diciamo a partire dal 1800, addirittura quando gli italiani si sono spostati negli Stati Uniti hanno visto crescere il proprio PIL dai $2 ai $150 giornalieri, e questa crescita della ricchezza esponenziale è, sempre nelle parole della professoressa McCloskey, il secondo evento più risolutivo ed epocale nella storia dell'uomo dopo l'agricoltura. In effetti questo arricchimento non si spiega con gli strumenti politici tradizionali, non si spiega con le teorie dello sfruttamento tipiche della sinistra, perché se effettivamente in una società a somma zero, la professoressa ha usato l'espressione tipicamente anglosassone da Pietro a Paolo, si sposta la ricchezza, è solo una ridistribuzione, e poi perché lo sfruttamento o il furto siano tali, deve esserci senz'altro qualche prova, qualche elemento che dimostri il movimento o il furto stesso. Lo sfruttamento e lo schiavismo infatti non sono elementi decisivi per la ricchezza, per esempio il Canada non ha mai avuto schiavi, eppure non è povero, così come non lo è l'imperialismo. In effetti la ricerca storica ha dimostrato che nessun tipo di imperialismo, neppure quello britannico, ha arricchito i cittadini del loro paese. È stato addirittura citato Leopoldo del Belgio, che pur essendosi impadronito di un paese intero, il Congo, non abbia fondamentalmente arricchito i suoi cittadini. Anche nel caso di investimenti, che possono essere sia monetari che culturali, quindi la professoressa McCloskey ha percepito la cultura come accumulo di conoscenza, investimenti sono necessari anche in senso culturale, ma non sufficienti al progresso. E quindi è chiaro che qualunque tipo di investimento, quindi sia esso effettivo o culturale, è assai meno efficace senza innovazione. E anche poi deve esserci anche una quantità ottimale di risorse. È stato fatto un esempio, sempre dalla professoressa, per cui 3 automobili possono essere ancora un bene, nelle sue stesse parole 4 cominciano a diventare un male, per cui l'accumulazione da sola, fin dai tempi di Adam Smith, che per scherzo la professoressa insomma menziona che si fa la croce ogni volta che lo nomina, dimostra che gli investimenti da soli non possono essere efficaci. Non solo, le idee da sole non bastano e peraltro neppure l'approccio statalista, la parola Stato è stata citata in italiano dalla professoressa, è responsabile della ricchezza e del benessere. Qualunque struttura, che sia statale o governativa, è nulla senza etica. Addirittura la professoressa ha detto che si può avere un qualunque numero di livelli statali che non sono efficaci se non si radicano nell'etica. Si tratta, sempre secondo la professoressa McCloskey, di qualcosa che gli svedesi forse non capirebbero, ma che gli italiani e che gli statunitensi di Chicago come lei sicuramente sì. Le istituzioni devono essere comunque intermediarie, ma non possono essere il primo mobile. Ora, il discorso in effetti che può diciamo risolvere il problema è quello del liberalismo, inteso anche in senso etico, per cui anche per esempio la schiavitù, che era qualcosa di devastante, ma che aveva una spiegazione etica, perché era citata nella Bibbia, che era basata su società servili, aveva una spiegazione etica per cui coloro che volevano mantenerla erano più persuasivi degli abolizionisti, ed è stato un altro cambiamento etico a far sì che la schiavitù decadesse definitivamente. Non solo, è proprio la persuasività dell'idea, nello specifico del liberalismo, che ha dato uno scopo a tutti, che è riuscita a liberare letteralmente, quindi un liberalismo che libera letteralmente, per la sua radice, le attività di tutti, è stato in effetti l'unico strumento etico, civile e politico che ha sostanzialmente consentito di liberare anche il potenziale umano, quindi delle persone che in effetti ne hanno poi fatto parte o che poi hanno deciso di vivere secondo questo sistema. È stato anche interessante notare come appunto in ossequio alla sua potenza espressiva la professoressa abbia scherzato sul fatto che sarebbe potuto andare avanti per circa 5 ore. Ho finito e vi ringrazio.
Abbiamo avuto il primo di questi 2 interventi, adesso passiamo a Joel Mokyr. Io ho detto all'inizio che si tratta di personalità diverse, che sono unite nella passione per la storia economica, ma devo aggiungere anche che c'è un'altra passione che li unisce, che è quella per la forza delle idee che sono in grado di cambiare il mondo. Perché anche Joel Mokyr, nella sua attività prestigiosa, ha fatto ricerche, studi, ha scritto libri di grandissimo rilievo per la storia delle idee e non solamente per la storia economica. Lui ha ricevuto nel 2015 il premio internazionale Balzan per la storia economica e la motivazione era per il pionieristico collegamento tra scienze economiche e storia, le teorie evolutive e cognitive, nonché lo sviluppo delle conoscenze e della tecnologia, che permettono di gettare un nuovo sguardo comparativo sullo sviluppo economico nel mondo occidentale, in particolar modo sull'industrializzazione, per la molteplicità di contenuti, aspetti e metodi che spaziano dalla cliometria fino alla nuova storia economica, soprattutto all'interpretazione quantitativa e qualitativa dei fenomeni economici, evitando spiegazioni monocausali. Joel Mokyr è nato a Leida, nei Paesi Bassi, ha studiato a Gerusalemme e a Yale, a partire dal 1974 ha insegnato nella Northwestern University, dove è professore di storia, professore di economia e storia. È stato visiting professor in numerosissime università e ha girato il mondo, Stanford, Chicago, Harvard, Dublino, Tel Aviv, Manchester. I primi lavori hanno riguardato la tarda industrializzazione in alcuni paesi come l'Irlanda, i Paesi Bassi, ma soprattutto ha prestato attenzione ai temi della crisi economica, si è distinto come grande esponente dell'economia e della storia, con un'attenzione particolare, come si è detto, all'industrializzazione e alle tecnologie. Il libro che ha scritto sulla creatività tecnologica e il progresso economico è una delle pietre miliari del suo percorso, ma anche il dono che le divinità ci offrono di conoscere le origini storiche dell'economia della conoscenza attraverso un confronto tra la conoscenza proposizionale e quella prescrittiva come condizione di una teoria economica che si interroga sulla produzione o sull'impedimento della conoscenza è stato di grande importanza. Però forse i suoi due lavori più significativi ai fini di questo nostro appuntamento sono quello che lui ha scritto sulla storia economica della Gran Bretagna tra il 1750 e il 1850, in cui ha messo in connessione il fenomeno dell'industrializzazione con quello dell'illuminismo e della rivoluzione francese. E questo è di grande importanza perché lì si è cominciato a fondare la sua teoria istituzionale, guardando soprattutto alle istituzioni britanniche, ma anche al rapporto tra istituzione ed idee. E poi alcuni lavori che hanno riguardato, ad esempio, la cultura della crescita. Ce n'è uno centrale che abbiamo presentato qualche mese fa che riguarda l'origine dell'economia moderna attraverso appunto la cultura della crescita, non solo attraverso le teorie della crescita e dello sviluppo. Mokyr si è distinto oltre che per l'attività editoriale anche per la presidenza dell'Economic History Association e ha contribuito alle basi di una storia economica operante a livello interdisciplinare, guardando in avanti, guardando non solo allo scenario internazionale, non solo alla sua generazione e agli studi della sua generazione, ma guardando verso il futuro e guardando alle tecnologie del futuro, a quelle della quarta rivoluzione industriale con grande attenzione e grande interesse. Insomma, anche qui ci troviamo di fronte a una personalità di assoluto livello internazionale. Io lo saluto, lo ringrazio e chiedo ad Antonio Buonacore di salutarlo anche a nome nostro nella sua lingua.
Professor Mokyr, good evening. I bring with me the greeting of everybody present at the event. You have been presented as a veritable globetrotter of academia and as God's gift to economic history, especially given the breadth and width of your knowledge, the fact that you have been a president of the Economic History Association, and you look at the future, especially concerning the industrialization and the fourth industrial revolution. Maybe the most important works you have produced concerning this event are those on Great Britain's history of industrialization connected with other historical events, and also your most recent work on the culture of growth as a new beginning, as a new stepstone. So I would like to give you all the heat and a very heartfelt welcome to this event.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen now, okay? So there we go, share screen, and...
One moment only, the title is Gli incentivi, le istituzioni e l'industrializzazione, un preludio alla crescita economica. Questo è il titolo dell'intervento di Joel Mokyr. Grazie a lui, prego.
Okay, can everybody see this? Can people see this? I'm getting no sound now, but I'm assuming people can see this. Somebody say if the slide is on there.
Okay, I think we can now. I think we can.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so this is the title, Incentives, Institutions and Industrialization. And I'm very glad and honored to be at this conference, and particularly, of course, honored to follow in the, the huge footsteps of my dear friend and colleague from all those years, Deirdre McCloskey. And, we agree, as she said, we agree on most things. Where there is some disagreement, perhaps, is on this issue of institutions. And let me just point out, perhaps, just this, and then I'll just get into the talk. I don't disagree that ethics and ideas matter. In fact, I've written about this at great length, ad nauseam, I would say. But I also think, like an economist, that incentives matter, that people respond to incentives. That, in some views, is the entire science of economics while standing on one leg. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. So let me go. So Deirdre said it very well. Why are we interested in the Industrial Revolution? Because the Industrial Revolution, in my view, was to economic history what, the emergence of monotheism is to the history of religion. It has some roots in the past. And if you look carefully, you find some of its characteristics in earlier on, but it is still the way what physics call a sort of a phase transition, in the sense that the entire mechanism of economics dynamics was changed. Until the Industrial Revolution, most economies were subject to a whole range of negative feedbacks that kept them at a low income. Some of them people say it was Malthusian. Some of them say it was decreasing returns to the growth of trade. There are other stories one can tell. But what it has now become since the Industrial Revolution is an economy of positive feedback in which growth becomes self-sustaining and irreversible. And the reason is that it is no longer based primarily on trade, it is based on knowledge, it is based on technology and on science and on the interaction between the two. And as Deirdre said, and we did not coordinate this, it is the greatest continuity in economic history since the Neolithic Revolution, because for the first time in history, a growing proportion of a rapidly growing population lived at a standard of living far beyond subsistence. And that is the big question. And I'm going to argue, and here Deirdre and I disagree, that institutions did matter. They're not the only thing that mattered, but they did matter. And as I said, this is still contested by some scholars. Deirdre's not the only one. But I'm going to try to convince you that this is still worth looking at. So let me briefly summarize the literature here. Basically, as I see it, is this literature in stressing institution has sort of two strands. One is what you would call general institutions that govern the state and other sort of political organizations. And the other are sort of specific institutions that pertain to something which is sort of uniquely British. So briefly about the general institutions. So this is an approach that's inspired and pioneered by my late dear friend Douglas North, of course, Nobel Prize winner in economics. And basically the argument is that political changes in England in the late 17th, maybe the entire 17th century, in the 18th century, created a political regime that was exceptionally friendly to things like property rights, liberal policies, and economic development. So what it did was it gave political power to a class of people with a commercial orientation. And the government had a friendly attitude to things like entrepreneurship and commerce and money making. And, in the language of political scientists, it created a regime in which there were constraints on the executive, meaning the king is no longer a dictator. And so there is, I would call this, and there is this literature on, 1688 and all was this sort of landmark event. And let me rephrase this a little bit and put it this way. After 1688, and maybe a little bit before that as well, they solved the problem of what I call meta-institutions. So here is what meta-institutions are. If institutions are, as North taught us, the rules by which the economy operates, then the higher level question arises. What are the rules by which society makes the rules? And the answer is these are made by meta-institutions. And that's a big debate in the 18th and 19th century. It leads repeatedly to bloody revolutions, of course, most famously the French revolutions, but elsewhere as well. And Parliament became, and I'm quoting here from the great English legal scholar Blackstone, the place where absolute despotic power, which must in all governments reside somewhere, is entrusted. Now, parliamentary rule, of course, is not a guarantee that is good for economic growth, but I think 18th century development drove it in that direction. And so the spirit of the time, I think, drove Parliament in a direction that we can see as progressive. And you can call this culture or beliefs or ideas, but one way or another, this is the age of enlightenment. And I think Parliament could not really operate independent of that. And so liberal and enlightened beliefs, as what Deirdre already said, led to eventually to the abolition of slavery, the rise of free trade, the disappearance of what they called in England old corruption. They extended the franchise. They emancipated non-Anglicans, they abolished a whole bunch of silly and antiquated mercantilist restrictions and constraints, such as usury laws and prohibitions of emigration and artisans. So, the economy became more free or more liberal. And because of this, the setup of Britain, these changes basically took place without violence and the political turmoil that disrupted life on the continent everywhere. And so by 1770 or so, Britain has a government that supported progress and innovation. And what I call the Industrial Enlightenment is the age of progress, not just because economic growth was widely felt, because it wasn't really yet in the 18th century, but because of the pervasive belief that economic progress is possible and desirable, which are not the same thing, and that it would be driven primarily by useful knowledge, by science and technology. And I think this matters a lot because innovation has many enemies, and it is resisted everywhere by vested interest, and primarily by workers concerned about their employment and skills, but also other artisans and so on. And so this led, of course, to famous phenomena of resistance called Luddism. And in Britain, I think by and large, the government was not sympathetic to this movement. They supported industrialists with force when needed. Now let me say something about specific institutions which are unique to Britain. And I'm going to talk about two of them, also there are more than that. But the four specific institutions which are largely, if not quite unique to Britain, are the following. One of them is the patent system, which encourages innovation. The other thing is the institutions underlying apprenticeship, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then the two other things that I will not have time to talk about, but they may have been important and are also fairly unique to Britain. One is a poor law system, which no other country had. And secondly, the freedom of mobility and internal integration, in the sense that Britain is a reasonably integrated economy in which goods and people can move about freely. So I'm going to talk only about the first two, although I could easily expand that if people want me to. But these things really affected technology most directly. And so deep down, they involve incentives, which is what institutions are supposed to be about. Let me say a few things about patents, okay? So for many scholars in following the work of Doug North, and most recently I can point to the book by Aghion et al. That came out just a month or so ago. And basically what they care about is intellectual property rights, so that you incentivize innovation by giving inventors a temporary monopoly, which you call a patent, and which, and I'm quoting here from Aghion's book, created incentives for inventors to innovate by granting them a temporary monopoly, so guaranteeing an innovation right. And the question is, does this, it makes sense, but does it stand the test of facts and data? So here are a few problems with it. The first is that the Netherlands, which really was fairly late to having an industrial revolution, actually had a patent system as well throughout this period. But in fact, very few patents were filed. And secondly, if you look at the British patent itself, English patent, I should say, it was actually little used before 1750. It had existed since 1624, but really little used, very little before 1750, and then it suddenly takes off. So as you can see here, until about the Industrial Revolution, say the middle of the 18th century, it's basically flat with a few bumps here and there, and then you can sort of see it take off during the Industrial Revolution. So it seems, at least from a very crude sort of ocular thing, that it's not the patents that are driving the Industrial Revolution, but it's the other way around. It leaves us, of course, with another problem of not explaining it. Now, it's also true that only a small percentage of inventions were ever patented, and then a lot of patents were dead ends and never led anywhere. Now, a few patents I immediately had were smashing successes and made their inventors rich. Of course, the steam engine is famous for that, but you can think about other things such as bleaching powder, patented by a Scotsman called Charles Tennant in 1798, and so on and so forth. And so, it's not that patents were unimportant. It's not, but it's just that a lot of people didn't patent. For one reason, it was expensive. The enforcement was uncertainty, and many judges were hostile. Patents were unpopular because people were, trained that monopolies were bad, but also because many inventors were scientists, and they followed this famous statement by the great French inventor Claude Berthollet, who wrote, he says, when one loves science, he says, one has little need for fortune, which would only risk one's happiness. Well, there are some people who thought like that. Also, economists would probably think they are in the minority. And the fact is that inventors were driven by, if they couldn't be reverse engineered, they were promised ex-ante prizes, especially, of course, the famous Board of Longitude, which promised a big financial prize to somebody in solving the problem. They gave a lot of people who made important inventions ex post rewards and pensions. Then, of course, there's always first mover advantage. Excuse me. First mover advantage, so you're the first one to exploit it, you're going to make the money. And finally, people cared about their reputation, and that's, I think, which is, I think, very important. So people invented for all kind of reasons, and making money surely was one of them, but economists, shouldn't kid ourselves. That's the only thing, being famous, having a reputation was another. Some people were altruistic. They just wanted to do good for humanity. You think about Edward Jenner, smallpox vaccine invention, or Humphrey Davy's, miner's friend, his lamp that wouldn't explode in coal mines. And there may even have been so intrinsic motivation. People just liked inventing. And so Britain had many famous inventors, but so did other countries. And then the question is, why Britain? And here I'm going to come to my second story about institutions, which is really something that I've come to believe in very strongly in the last 5 or 10 years. Now, you needed to have an industrial revolution, you needed more than inventors, right? You needed businessmen, managers, financiers, entrepreneurs, and Britain had these. They were, after all, again, quoting Blackstone, they were a polite and commercial nation. But what really counted here is the mechanics and artisans who not only built the new machines, but installed them and operated them and repaired them when they broke down, which happened all the time. And Britain had far more of those than any other countries. It's important to say that this is knowledge, but it's a very different kind of knowledge. It's tacit knowledge in the sense that it involved learned skills that can't be really codified, and that people can't even fully describe or put in words, let alone teach it formally. So the way these things were taught was through imitation and informal in-person contact. And that, I think, is the key to the creation of mechanical competence. So there is abundant evidence that British artisans in the 18th century were far more skilled and competent and agile and productive than those of other countries. In part, we know this because British engineers and other technical experts were wandering all over the continent, all the way from Russia to Belgium and from Sweden to Italy, installing, repairing, organizing, teaching, consulting, and managing everything. And everybody, writing on both sides of the channel basically said the same thing. British mechanics and engineers were superior, and that gave Britain a significant advantage at the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. So here is a famous quote. This is actually prophetically by a Swiss manufacturer, said, "For a thing to be perfect, it has to be invented in France and worked out in England." And remember, even the steam engine had strong continental roots. The first model was built by a Frenchman called Denis Papin, based on the theories developed by Italian scientists such as Evangelista Torricelli. So, I mean, this is clearly not a British monopoly, but they were the ones to build the steam engines and develop them because they had the mechanics who could do it. And so how come? And this is where institutions come back in. The most important institution, I think, that here behind this is how mechanics and engineers are produced themselves, and that is through apprenticeship. And apprenticeship is how society produces skills. And if you think about it, it's a transaction, right, between a master and a young lad whose parents or guardians send him to study with this master. And one of the things that we have found, and this is one paper I've written with co-authors, there's a bunch of other things, is that Britain's system is uniquely flexible and capable of a strong supply response. And the main reason is that elsewhere on the continent, in most places, these apprenticeship contracts are enforced by guilds. And in Britain, that is just not the case. In Britain, they had to solve the problem of how to enforce these contracts. And you think about the contract. It's a difficult contract. It's what we call in economics an incomplete contract. It's a non-repeated game with asymmetrical information in which both sides have many possibilities for opportunistic behavior and shirking. And verifying quality is, of course, very hard, and specifying all contingencies is impossible. Now, in most societies in the world at the time, actually, apprenticeship takes place within the extended family or the clan. But of course, in Europe, clans had long been relegated to a less importance, and it's committed to nuclear families. And so artisans are trained by non-relatives. And this is a contract that is enforced by craft guilds. And craft guilds actually did a reasonable job, but as these guilds are in business to protect their rents and protect the masters, this system becomes increasingly rigid. And so in Britain, we see from the 16th century on, the guilds losing power in doing this. And and other agencies start to intervene. One of them is the state, of course, itself. So the state in 1562 passes this famous law, the Statute of Artificers, which regulated the rules of apprenticeship. Now, there's some debate of whether it was applied strictly or not. I don't think so, but it indicates the importance that they gave in Britain to third-party enforcement of that are not guilds. And so what you see happening in Britain is two things. The first is that contract enforcement relies on local authorities and takes place in what is known as the sort of the shadow of the law. Let's just say the ability of one of the parties to go actually to court, which was very expensive and inflicted high costs on both parties. But both sides have sort of this credible threat of what they call a grim strategy, which is enough to create a self-enforcing equilibrium in which most players could cooperate and bring about a reasonably workable outcome. I say here efficient, I'm not too sure that that's actually true, but certainly workable. And what's more, apprenticeship contracts were supported by reputations in local communities in small towns, which is most of England outside London. People knew one another and they met in pubs and clubs. And if you misbehaved toward his apprentice by not teaching him or beating him up or doing all kinds of things, you took the risk of not being regarded as a gentleman. And this would be very costly, both economically and socially. The same is true of apprentices. If an apprentice misbehaved or was lazy or rebellious, we would suffer even more costly damage to their reputations. And so the result is that by the, say, 1700, this system in Britain works vastly better than anybody else. And Britain just produces more and better technicians, mechanics, and engineer. And so when the technology begins to change, when people start getting ideas, the industrialists could find the skilled engineers to carry them out. And one reason that James Watt and Leonardo da Vinci both had lots of good technological ideas, but Leonardo's were never built. And James Watt's was. Why? Because he could get the skilled mechanics and workmen who actually carried out this. And what is striking is that you see the demand for labor going up as the economy advanced, but there is no rise in the skill premium. And that suggests, of course, a successful system that supplies engineers elastically. So in sum then, think about institutions. Are they the driving factor of economic history? And were they exogenous? And so, you know, institutions come from somewhere, and Deirdre is absolutely right, that institutions basically are driven in large part, if not entirely, by culture or belief. Now, other people argue the other way around. Institutions drive culture, not the other way around. So this is a debate worth having, but probably not now. But the main thing that we have to keep in mind here, the underlying ideas of European institutions is this movement which we call the Enlightenment. And so people, I came up with the term industrial enlightenment, and then we had a medical enlightenment and an agricultural enlightenment, and so on and so forth. But to thrive, you know, I think the Enlightenment needed the right institutional environment. And it is striking that other literate and educated societies such as Islamic world or China did not experience anything like it, you know. And so why is it that European institutions were different enough to generate a movement that produces people who think outside the box, like Spinoza or Diderot or Hume? And of course, this is a long story, but I submit to you that the Enlightenment came out of something that we call a competitive market for ideas. And unlike China or the Islamic world, Europe produced something which I call the 3Ds: dissent, discord, and dispute, which takes place in a fractured and fragmented world where there's no state had any monopoly power outside its borders. And that, I think, makes for a huge difference. And so the Talmud says, you know, this jealousy of scholars shall multiply wisdom. And so the highly competitive market for ideas in the 16th and 17th century produced a great deal of knowledge and wisdom, and a few of the scientific insight led to technological breakthroughs, so most of that, of course, was to happen after 1780. And so for details, I now have to end, but for details, this is where I would all send you. You can see this is a beautiful cover, and many of the things that I talked about today are there, elaborated in great deal, ad nauseam, you could say. Thank you.
Che questi due interventi, queste due lezioni sono state straordinarie. Ringraziamo sia Deirdre McCloskey che Joel Mokyr per il loro intervento. Purtroppo, come abbiamo spiegato, c'è la necessità di arrivare alla conclusione. Sarebbero stati disponibili a rimanere ancora con noi, ma siccome il pubblico non è solo quello presente, ma anche il pubblico in rete, abbiamo esigenza di arrivare al termine di questi nostri lavori, sperando, e lo prego Antonio Buonocore di avvisare sia Mokyr che la McCloskey, pregandoli di assicurare la loro disponibilità a tornare non solo da remoto. Sarebbero stati qui tra di noi in presenza se non ci fossero state limitazioni al viaggio dagli Stati Uniti in Italia. Oggi è stata una giornata molto intensa. Oltre questi due magnifici interventi, ci sono state tra ieri e oggi personalità che hanno onorato questo rapporto tra scienze sociali, le scienze economiche, quelle storiche, la filosofia. Abbiamo avuto Sebastiano Maffettone, abbiamo avuto Luigi Mascilli Migliorini, abbiamo avuto tra gli economisti Lucrezia Reichlind, Claudio De Vincenti, Giuseppe Coco, e per le scienze dure, le cosiddette scienze dure, abbiamo avuto Aurelia Sole, Gaetano Manfredi, Rosario Mazzola. Insomma, siamo stati tra due culture. E pienamente tra due culture Stefano Rolando, che insieme a Claudio De Vincenti ha promosso questa iniziativa. Io devo un ringraziamento finale, oltre che a Joel Mokyr e a Deirdre McCloskey, che saluto molto affettuosamente e ringrazio per la loro disponibilità, cosa rara nel mondo accademico, soprattutto internazionale. Voglio anche ringraziare i tecnici che ci hanno accompagnato in questa giornata e in particolare vorrei ringraziare, ci ascolta da lontano e ha fatto la regia a distanza di questo evento, Giulia D'Argenio. Domani, grazie a Giulia, grazie a Patrizia Edoardo Nitti, e domani noi ci vedremo, grazie alle istituzioni, il Presidente del Consiglio regionale è stato con noi tutta la giornata. Domani concluderemo questa iniziativa con una mattinata molto significativa, perché avremo una presenza di grandi personalità nazionali ed europee, insieme appunto a Merita e a Fondazione Nitti. Avremo la presenza del vicepresidente della Corte Costituzionale Giuliano Amato, che parlerà dell'unità nazionale nella Costituzione italiana. Poi avremo Sud e Nord, complessità e reciprocità, con gli interventi di Gerardo Bianco, presidente dell'Animi, e di Anna Finocchiaro, presidente di Italia Decide. E infine, al termine di questa mattinata, avremo Daniele Franco, ministro dell'economia e delle finanze, e Paolo Gentiloni, commissario europeo all'economia, che parleranno di Mezzogiorno, Italia, Europa, e i nostri lavori saranno conclusi da Claudio De Vincenti e Stefano Rolando. Buonasera a tutti, a domani. Ecco qui, Claudio De Vincenti.
No, vorrei ringraziare, oltre che a Giulia che ci sta sentendo, ma ci controlla, è una cosa lasciamo perdere, Edoardo Nitti che ha curato qui in presenza il coordinamento dei nostri lavori e spostamenti, e i nostri amici che stanno qui in fondo alla sala e che hanno curato tutte le visualizzazioni. Poi un ringraziamento anche a Donatella Antonioli che ha curato l'ufficio stampa, e a Dolle che ha dato una mano anche lì dietro le quinte ai nostri tecnici che hanno curato questo lavoro. Grazie veramente a tutti.
Buonasera.